Good afternoon, and welcome to the latest podcast of Shooting Straight with me, Voice of the Forge. Today has been a good day. For quite some time, I had a WordPress blog that I'd been locked out of, and as a result, I knew that some of my writings and information were out there on the World Wide Web, and I could read them, but I couldn't find a way in which to get them back. And today, I thankfully, whilst going through some paperwork, actually found the details which meant I could log in, and the original email address that I'd used. So I am quite happy about that, but one of the things that it brought up for me was late last year, before Gamergate really took off. I was writing about things like what makes a game, and things which actually look to deconstruct the actual narrative of play so that we could understand why a game was a game. And I find this somewhat unusual, because we now have an argument about what a game is because of things like Gone Home, which are little more than interactive stories. Now, the article piece that I wrote on the blog was taken from the category of needs, whereby you have to have your food, your comfort, your housing, and then at the top of the pyramid you then have things like self-actualization, skill challenges and things like this. And I did research, and I wrote the blog piece based on the fact that for a game to actually have some kind of hold on a player, it's got to meet certain criteria, and those criteria have to fit in somewhere in the criteria of needs. Otherwise, they're not doing something which is enjoyable, which means that you're not going to carry on playing the game, which means that it fails in its objective. And I was looking at things which are common to all games, whether they're board games, card games, video games especially. But the idea is the fact that you've got a set of base points that you can refer to that the majority of games will score against. Now, not every game will have every point, but then again, that's the idea, is the fact that if you have something which is a pastime which scores maybe 8 out of the 10, then you are looking at something which you can quite definitely say is a game. But if it only scores 1 or 2, then calling it a game might not actually be a good idea. And I wrote this piece at the time when I was hoping that we might be able to take Forgotten Forge games into an area where we could actually start doing games reviews and things more openly, with more tech and better premises than we had at the time. Unfortunately, that all fell through, and that's the reason why that blog fell silent. But I've now got it back, and I've now got it linked to these podcasts. But the other thing that it also made me realise was that we are now in an era where everyone can change the definition of a word to basically mean what they say they want it to mean, which is why we're now seeing words like misandry, misogyny, and sexism, and hatred between men and women kind of almost becoming devalued, because every time someone takes offence at something, it's racist, you're misogynist, you're sexist. We've got the outcry of rape culture, and we do have people that change the meaning of words from their dictionary definition just so that they can argue semantics on a point and try to browbeat people over the head with them. And this led me into looking into the actual idea between information as it's provided and what people actually take from the information sources that we have. We live in a world where we now have facts almost at the touch of a button. It may take a couple of presses, key in a word, hit enter, but virtually there, where if we have a question or we have a dispute, we are able, within seconds now, to be able to actually argue a point between people and actually have the ability to have an independent third-party arbiter in the form of Google or another search engine to look it up on the computer so quickly it isn't funny. And yet we have these myths and we have these misperceptions which are current and haven't changed. Now, I've been using trial by Google with my friends for some time. I was doing it back in 2005 with a friend of mine who thought he knew more Latin than I did and was actually telling me Latin translations which I knew were false. And Google was the only way that I could actually get him to see that what he was quoting was the wrong quote, and actually give him the right translation for the quote that he thought he was using. And as it turned out, he had made a mistake. He'd got two quotes mixed up. But without Google, it would have taken me hours to go into the library, actually find the quote that I knew it was, then cross-reference to find the other quote, and then have to then take the books out, wait until he'd come back round to my house again, and then we'd have to have the discussion again if we remembered, and that's a key point, if we remembered to have the discussion before we could even sort that out. Now it's, I say this, you say that, oh really, I think it's this, I might be wrong, but let's check. And we can be sorted in a very, very short amount of time. Now, there's a problem with this, because what we've seen today is that people want to have their own facts. They want to have their own theories as to the way in which things go. And this takes me back to Sherlock Holmes. This takes me back to one of the greatest things that was ever said by a fictional character. Okay, and that is, it is a capital mistake to theorise before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories, instead of theories to suit facts. And that is what we can see with regards to the social justice warrior and the whole thing that has kick-started Gamergate and now looks to be enveloping into the larger Mediagate, as we can see that it's not just confined to the games media. Other press media are starting to take note, and we are starting to see a backlash in more than one area. We've already talked about the Hugos and Sad and Baby Puppies. We've already talked about Comicgate, and we've also had, for a period of time, was Metalgate, where they decided to go after Baphomet, but that's something else entirely. But we're starting to see a pushback in more than just this niche area of the press, and it's starting to gain momentum and become something bigger. And I reckon this could morph into a full-scale Mediagate, whereby journalistic integrity can be called out in a huge swathe of the mainstream media. Now, this is very important to this information versus misinformation, because, say for instance, we look at the reporting of genetically modified organisms. Now, there's a lot of press out there on both sides which argue about them being dangerous or being safe. And if we look at some of the surveys that have been done, and the surveys in this podcast I'm looking at are American, even though I'm UK-based, purely because there's a wealth of data out there that is far easier to find than the UK and European stats. And what we find is when we talk about the science of the GMO, the science of the genetically modified organism, we find that scientists are 88% happy with the science, that they're safe and everything else. And yet that only translates to a 37% of the actual lay population, the non-specialist people. And there seems to be this sensitivity in the UK and in America that there is a belief that crime is rising. And yet, globally, we are probably living in one of the more peaceful times in human history, and especially when you consider how crowded the world is, the actual rate of death through violence is actually falling through the floor. And this is being led by the US and the UK. So there's a massive disconnect between crime and the fear of crime. Now, where does that fear of crime come from? Where does this massive discrepancy and distortion of perception and reality get its momentum? Where does it get its critical mass? Well, there are some quite interesting stats other than the ones that I've just mentioned. For instance, in America, if you were to ask someone what they thought the average what the average unemployment rate is, the average respondent was roughly around about 32%, whereas the reality is closer to 6%, and the highest peak that the statisticians had in the reports that I read was at 25%, and that was during the Great Depression. So there's this reality that the unemployment at the moment is higher than it was in the 1930s after the Great Crash and the years that led on to the Great Depression. So again, there seems to be this disconnect between what people feel they are being told and what the actual reality is. Another one is fear of religious acculturation, and that is most commonly seen through Islam. And if you were to look at the same studies, then if we were looking at what people thought the population was Muslim were in these studies, as an average, people said around 15%, whereas the actual truth was closer to 1%. That's a massive, massive discrepancy, and of course we have to take these stats with a pinch of salt, because we also have the fact that a third of Americans do believe in a personal God. They believe in a man that actually created the world in 6 days, and that evolution is wrong and everything else. So there are other anomalies, shall we say, about what people believe as reverse to the reality. But as a general population, these were the papers that I found and the averages that I was reading. And there is only a few places where you can get this kind of misinformation, bearing in mind that we are drowning in information when we go online. We are absolutely inundated by it, and that means that we employ filters. And before we even go online, it is these filters that are with us day in, day out. They colour how we see people, they colour events, they colour how whether or not we're happy, whether or not we're sad, whether or not we're going to be friendly or nice to the next person that cuts us up or does something, whether or not we're going to be aggressive, whether or not we're just going to shrug it off and say, oh, it's no big deal. All these things come together as part of one's personality and frame of reference for life. And then when we have this much information, when we go online, we are predisposed to bias, and we do tend to double down on things where we find things that do not back us up, which is why I've always been very careful to try and identify bias when I'm talking. Now, people know, with the information that I've already disseminated, that I am quite pro certain consumerist movements. That doesn't mean to say that I don't call out the bad apples and the bad behaviour that was occurring much more prevalently at the start, and then as things have settled down, I will now call anyone out who turns around and says, well, it's all about this. Because I can turn around and say, well, hold on a minute there, sunshine. This is the evidence. This was what was going on back then. And you can't use the logical fallacy of guilt by association for something that happened 9 months ago, where someone might have come into the movement last week. And not only that, but it's also another logical fallacy about the origin of a movement. Just because a movement begins in a certain way doesn't mean to say that it can't evolve and move past those routes. But otherwise, we wouldn't have most of the movements we've got today. I mean, look at suffragettes. You look at suffragism in the UK, and some of the people that were working for the enfranchisement of women to get the vote were quite nasty people. They were quite hardline and very, very, very aggressive in the way they did it. Did people call them out? Yes, they did. And they actually held back the suffragist movement for quite some time, because whilst their message was valid, their actions weren't. And yet we still see the suffragist movement moving into feminism as being a worthy thing, even though its roots at the beginning weren't that great. So it is a logical fallacy just to say that because things happened in July and August last year, that by the time we got to October last year and things had changed somewhat, that it's all the same actors, is all the same people doing the same things. And yet on the other side, it's the very same people that have pressed this narrative, continuing all the way through, to be professional victims, because that's the only way they gain traction. And who is to blame for the vast majority of the filters that we see? Well, not only do we have our personal filters, which means that we actually choose to look at various things, like it's a choice whether or not to watch CNN or Fox, but then we actually have what the filters are in place on the media itself. And whilst we say, well, if we're choosing Fox because of our personal filters, then that's also explaining some of the mainstream media filters, that's only part of the story, because we have sensationalism and we have the clickbaity type of things, which people will view far more. And if you can frame something as a negative, people will remember a negative far more than they'll remember a positive. So that's a filter that gets put in place, which people don't often realise. But the biggest problem we have now in this world of 24-hour news culture is that the line has become irrevocably blurred between the news being informative and being something which is there to inform and pass on facts and to be able to actually show what the world is like, and it's now becoming much more entertainment, which means that we no longer have a disconnect between, oh look, this is entertainment if we look at this and we do this and we do that, and this is meant to be enjoyed and it's meant to be looked at in a certain way, to, oh look, this is the news, isn't the world horrible, and it bleeds in altogether, so that what we're actually consuming as entertainment is the same as what we're consuming as news. And it is in this juxtaposition that niche markets like gaming journalism find themselves, where we have an enthusiast press that are blogging for news value, as in this game is coming out in this month, in this year, which is news, versus, oh, I think this game is great, because, oh look, I've played the first level, this is what we can do, and it stops becoming news information and it starts becoming entertainment information. And this is where we have a massive problem with mainstream media and gaming journalism, is where those lines have basically been so blurred that they virtually no longer exist, and the filters between something which is meant to be informative and something which is meant to be entertaining have become distorted, and they have become warped. And because this warping has been so subtle and so gradual, it's like walking with a pebble in your foot. After a while, it becomes easier to change the way that you walk, to stop the pain of the pebble as you step. But if you walk on that pebble long enough, then when you take your shoe off and take the pebble out, and then carry on walking, you will carry on walking with that same adaptation to your step as if the pebble was still there, because you expect pain to exist as if that pebble was there, even though it's been removed. So if you can see that warping in our actual filters in how we take in news, and then we can see that there's a warping in the mainstream media as well. These two almost have a reinforcing effect, a magnification effect, which means that we then start looking at the news in a completely different way to the way in which it would have been looked at maybe 100 years ago, maybe 50 years ago. And because of that, we now have the issues we've got where propaganda basically is indistinguishable between news, which is informative, news which is opinion, news which is basically provided for you to get to buy something, which is basically an advertisement, and they've all blurred and they've all become this big eaten mess, and it is no longer very easy, unless you've got an understanding of how these things are put together, to be able to discern where all the various fractures and lines occur. And because of this, it means that the great public, who don't look at this critically because they're just used to what's on the TV, they watch it, they take it in, they have their preferences for what they want to watch, don't realise that they're being sold a very distorted and very what's the word I'm looking for? I've lost it right at the very end. Here I am, a minute away from finishing the podcast, and there's a word that I can't remember. I hate it when this happens. Basically, you've got an audience which is uncritically taking in and absorbing the information that's being given, but this information is being distorted and mirrored and focused in certain areas and ignored in others. And this interference pattern, which would usually work in the mainstream media, where one news outlet would cover something and the majority of the news would get through. We've now got this laser-like focus where everyone seems to follow on the same stories, which we call collusion when they happen in certain ways, because it doesn't happen by random or by accident. There's a very specific agenda behind that. But that's a topic for another podcast, otherwise I'll be here for another 10 minutes. We would actually have this distorted reality, but because it's so distorted, and because we're unaware that it's distorted, we view it as reality, which means that when we take polls and we find these statistical anomalies about how these things have come about, we're shocked when people don't know where certain places in the world are, or we don't know who the president of the United States is, and we think that, and people think that the president of the United States is also the president of the UK. They don't realise that that the UK has a prime minister, for instance. Never mind what he's called. And it's these things and these facts and all these little bits and pieces which basically serve to dumb down and control people, because all that you're being given is propaganda and a filtering of facts through a lens of opinion, which basically means that the facts are so far distorted from true, they might as well have been nailed to a cross, crucified, and then cut up with a steel meat grinder. These things do not bear any resemblance to one another when they've gone through several processes of media manipulation and spin. Now that's taken me a bit longer than I thought to get through, even including the mind blank, so as always I am Voice of the Forge. You can find me at Twitter at Voice of the Forge. I now have the Voice of the Forge WordPress blog back up and running, which this will also be posted to as well. And if you have any comments, then please feel free to message me and leave a comment on Twitter or on YouTube, Dailymotion, or now on the weblog itself. And I thank you very much for listening, and have a good evening.